The moment Margaret Whitmore pressed that red button on her phone, calling the tow truck to remove what she smugly dismissed as neighborhood trash. She had no idea she was about to obstruct a federal investigation into the deadliest aviation. Disaster in state history. The twisted metal sitting in David Chen's driveway wasn't junk, it was evidence. Evidence that 3 NTSB investigators had been desperately searching for. Evidence that would prove 17 people didn't have to die. And in exactly 4 hours, when Special Agent Rodriguez arrived with a warrant and a very short temper, Margaret's perfectly manicured world was about to crash harder than Flight 447. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Estates as Margaret Whitmore adjusted her reading glasses and squinted at the eyesore, ruining her view of the pristine cul-de-sac. The twisted chunk of metal had been sitting in David Chen's driveway for 3 weeks now, and she'd had enough. Absolutely unacceptable, she muttered, her manicured fingers drumming against the granite countertop of her kitchen island. The HOA handbook lay open beside her morning coffee, its pages dog-eared from constant reference. Section 4.7, subsection C, was crystal clear. No inoperable vehicles, machinery, or debris shall remain visible from public areas for more than 72 hours. 3 weeks, 21 days of property values plummeting, while her neighbor played with his little airplane hobby. Margaret had tried the diplomatic approach first, naturally. She'd knocked on David's door 4 times, left 3 polite notes, and even sent a formal HOA violation notice. Each time, the man had given her the same infuriating response: "It's not what you think it is, Mrs. Whitmore. I need a few more days." Well, those days were up. She dialed the number for Apex Towing, with the satisfaction of a woman who'd finally found the perfect weapon. "Yes, I need a vehicle removed from 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. It's abandoned property on private land. Yes, I have the authority. I'm the HOA president." Across the street, David Chen was in his garage, hunched over a laptop surrounded by aviation charts and technical manuals. Dark circles rimmed his eyes. He hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. "Not since the call that changed everything, Sarah. I'm telling you, this piece is crucial," he said into his phone, his voice tight with exhaustion. "The stress fracture patterns don't match the preliminary report. If I'm right about this, we're looking at a manufacturing defect, not pilot error." Dr. Sarah Martinez, NTSB investigator and David's former colleague, sighed heavily through the phone. "David, I know you want to help, but you're not officially on this case. The FAA made that clear when they transferred you to desk duty." "Desk duty for asking too many questions," David shot back, running his hand through his graying hair. "Sarah, 17 people died. 17. And they want to blame Captain Morrison. The man had 30 years of experience and a spotless record. The chunk of metal in his driveway wasn't just debris, it was part of the wing assembly from Midwest, Regional Flight 447, which had crashed 3 weeks ago during what should have been a routine landing. David had been on the initial investigation team until he'd started questioning the official narrative. His transfer to administrative duties had been swift and decisive, but David Chen hadn't spent 15 years as an aeronautical engineer, just to rubber stamp convenient conclusions. When his contact at the crash site had quietly passed him this critical piece of evidence, David knew he had to act. "I need 3 more days," he told Sarah. "The independent lab results should be back by then. If I'm wrong, I'll drop it. But if I'm right, if you're right, you'll be vindicated, and I'll personally apologize to Captain Morrison's widow." Sarah said softly, "Just be careful, David. There are people who don't want this investigation to go deeper." David was about to respond when the rumble of a diesel engine caught his attention. Through his garage window, he watched a massive tow truck turn onto Maple Ridge Drive, its yellow warning lights flashing like a beacon of doom. "No, no, no," he breathed, dropping the phone as he rushed outside. Margaret Whitmore stood on her front porch, arms crossed, watching the show with undisguised satisfaction. She timed it perfectly. David would be at work, unable to interfere with the removal of his precious junk. "Excuse me?" David called out, jogging toward the tow truck. Driver, who was already backing up to the wing assembly, "You can't take that." The driver, a burly man with Apex Towing embroidered on his shirt, looked up from his controls. "You, the property owner?" "Yes, and I'm telling you, you cannot remove that equipment." "Sorry, buddy. Got a work order, right?" Here he waved a clipboard. Property owner requested removal of abandoned vehicle. I'm the property owner, David's voice rose. I never requested any removal. Margaret descended from her porch like a queen addressing her subjects. Mr. Chen, according to our HOA bylaws, that ... thing constitutes a violation of our community standards. As HOA president, I have the authority to authorize its removal. David's face flushed red. Mrs. Whitmore, I've explained this to you. This isn't just scrap metal. This is part of an ongoing federal investigation. Federal investigation. Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Mr. Chen, really? We all know you're not working on anything important anymore. The whole neighborhood heard about your ... situation. At the airport, the words hit David like a physical blow. His situation, his demotion, his professional humiliation had become neighborhood gossip. He could see curtains twitching. In nearby windows, neighbors emerging to watch the drama unfold. Look, lady, the tow truck driver interrupted. I don't know anything about investigations. I got a work order, and I'm going to complete it. You two figure out your HOA drama on your own time. Wait. David pulled out his phone, frantically scrolling through his contacts. Sarah, I need you to call this tow truck company right now. Tell them this is evidence in a federal investigation. But it was too late. The hydraulic whine of the tow trucks. Lift filled the air as the wing assembly was hoisted onto the flatbed. 3 weeks of careful preservation, of protecting what might be the key to proving 17 people died unnecessarily, was being undone by a woman who saw only property values and neighborhood aesthetics. This is insane, David said, his voice breaking. You have no idea what you've done. Margaret's smile was arctic. I've done what needed to be done. This is a respectable neighborhood, Mr. Chen. Perhaps you should consider whether you still belong here. As the tow truck rumbled away, carrying with it the evidence that could exonerate Captain Morrison and expose the truth about Flight 447, David felt something snap inside him. His career was already in ruins. His reputation was destroyed. But he wouldn't let 17 innocent people be forgotten because of one woman's petty tyranny. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never used. Special Agent Rodriguez. This is David Chen. I need to report an obstruction of justice in a federal aviation investigation, and I need to report it now. Margaret Whitmore watched him make the call, her satisfied smile never wavering. Federal investigation, indeed. As if the disgraced airport employee could intimidate her with empty threats. She had no idea that in exactly 4 hours her doorbell would ring and the person standing on her porch would be carrying a badge, a warrant, and 16 years of experience in making people who interfered with federal investigations very, very sorry they had ever been born. Special Agent Alina Rodriguez had seen plenty of crime scenes in her 16 years with the NTSB's Enforcement Division, but Willowbrook Estates looked more like a movie set than the site of federal obstruction. Manicured lawns stretched like green carpets between McMansions, each driveway occupied by luxury SUVs that cost more than most people's annual salaries. This is it, she told her partner, Agent Marcus Webb, as their black sedan pulled up to 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, the Chen residence. Webb consulted his tablet. And our obstruction suspect lives ... right across the street. Elena's dark eyes fixed on the imposing colonial with the perfectly symmetrical flower beds. 1248 Maple Ridge Drive, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, age 54, HOA president for 3 years running. Alina had been in Washington when David Chen's call came through. She'd been trying to piece together why a critical section of Flight 447's wing assembly had gone missing from the secured evidence warehouse. Now she knew it had never made it there in the first place. Chen was smart to take possession of it. Webb said, reviewing the case file, if this piece proves the wing failure was due to manufacturing defects rather than pilot error, then Morrison's family gets justice, and Meridian Aircraft Corporation gets a very expensive lawsuit, Alina finished, which explains why certain people wanted Chen off the investigation. The front door of 1247 opened before they could knock. David Chen looked like he'd aged a decade in the 4 hours since his phone call. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes held the desperate intensity of a man watching his last chance slip away. Agent Rodriguez, thank God you're here. David's voice cracked with relief. "I've been calling every towing company in the city. No one will tell me where they took it. Mr. Chen." Elena's handshake was firm, professional. "I'm going to need you to walk me through exactly what happened. Start from the beginning." As David recounted the morning's events, Elena found herself impressed by his attention to detail. This wasn't a man making wild accusations. This was a trained investigator who'd been systematically silenced for asking inconvenient questions. The wing section showed clear signs of metal fatigue along the primary stress points, David explained, pulling up photos on his laptop, but not the kind you'd expect from normal wear. These fracture patterns suggest a manufacturing flaw in the aluminum alloy composition itself. Webb leaned over Elena's shoulder to examine the images. "That's a hell of an accusation, Chen. Meridian Aircraft has government contracts worth billions, which is exactly why the preliminary report blamed pilot error instead of looking deeper," David shot back. "Captain Morrison was a convenient scapegoat. Dead men can't defend themselves." Elena had seen this pattern before corporations using their political influence to shape investigations, especially when the stakes were high enough, but she'd also seen what happened to federal agents who pushed too hard against powerful interests. "Mr. Chen, I need you to understand something," she said carefully. "If you're right about this manufacturing defect, we're not just talking about 17 deaths. We're talking about potentially hundreds of aircraft with the same flaw still in service. This goes beyond one crash." David's face went pale. "You think there could be others?" "I think we need to get that evidence back before anyone else decides. It's inconvenient." Across the street, Margaret Whitmore was having the worst afternoon of her perfectly ordered life. It had started when her husband called from his law office. "Margaret, what the hell did you do?" Richard Whitmore's voice was tight with panic. "I just got off the phone with Tom Bradley at the firm. His contact at the NTSB says federal agents are asking questions about some kind of obstruction case." In our neighborhood, Margaret had laughed it off. "Oh, that's just David Chen making noise. You know how he's been since he got demoted. I had his junk towed this morning, and now he's trying to make it sound important." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Margaret," Richard's voice dropped to the tone he used in court when he was about to destroy an opposing witness. "Tell me you didn't interfere with federal evidence." "It wasn't evidence, Richard. It was a piece of scrap metal, making our neighborhood look like a junkyard." "Jesus Christ, Margaret. Do you have any idea what you might have done?" The call had ended with Richard promising to fix this, and Margaret left standing in her kitchen, feeling the first tiny crack in her armor of certainty. The crack became a chasm when she looked out her front window and saw the black sedan with government plates. Margaret's hands shook as she called her friend Linda Morrison, not the Captain Morrison who'd died in the crash, but Linda Morrison from the country club whose husband sat on the city council. "Linda, I need you to tell me everything you know. About that plane crash 3 weeks ago, the one in Ohio. Horrible tragedy." "Why do you, Margaret? You sound upset. Just tell me what you know." Linda's voice took on the conspiratorial tone she used for premium gossip. "Well, Roger says there's been some controversy about the investigation. Apparently, the preliminary report blamed the pilot, but some people think there might have been mechanical issues. The pilot's widow is threatening to sue the aircraft manufacturer." Margaret's mouth went dry. "Mechanical issues? Something about the wing breaking apart in flight. Roger says if they can prove it was a manufacturing defect rather than pilot error, it could be the biggest aviation lawsuit in history. But they'd need physical evidence, and supposedly some key piece of the wreckage went missing from the investigation site." The phone slipped from Margaret's numb fingers, clattering onto her marble countertop. The piece of wreckage that went missing, the twisted metal in David Chen's driveway, the junk she'd had towed away in her righteous fury about property values. Margaret sank onto her kitchen stool, her mind racing through the implications. If David had been telling the truth about federal investigations, if that really was evidence from a plane crash, then she had just a sharp knock at her front door made her jump. Through the frosted glass panels, she could see 2 dark, tall men and a shorter woman. Margaret smoothed her hair, straightened her shoulders, and reminded herself that she was Margaret Whitmore, HOA president, wife of a prominent attorney, pillar of the community. Whatever this was about, she could handle it. She opened the door with her most practiced smile. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" The woman was Latina, probably mid-40s, with sharp, dark eyes and the kind of no-nonsense bearing that suggested she'd seen things Margaret couldn't imagine. The man beside her was younger, black, with the build of someone who spent time in the gym and the alert posture of someone accustomed to danger. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. The woman's voice was professionally courteous, but with an undertone that made Margaret's stomach clench. Yes. The woman reached into her jacket and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold badge and federal identification. I'm Special Agent Alina Rodriguez with the National Transportation Safety Board. This is Agent Webb. We need to speak with you about events that occurred this morning involving the removal of federal evidence from 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Federal evidence. The words echoed in her mind like a death knell. I don't understand, she managed. Agent Rodriguez's smile was arctic. Mrs. Whitmore, you're going to want to sit down for this conversation, and you might want to call your attorney. As Margaret stepped aside to let the federal agents into her home, she caught sight of David Chen standing in his driveway across the street. He wasn't gloating or celebrating her downfall. Instead, his face held something far worse: disappointment, as if he'd genuinely hoped she might be a better person than she'd proven to be. The door closed behind the agents with a sound like a coffin lid sealing shut, and Margaret Whitmore realized that her perfectly controlled world was about to become very, very uncontrolled. Margaret's living room had always been her sanctuary, a testament to her impeccable taste and social standing. Persian rugs, original artwork, furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Now it felt like an interrogation chamber, with two federal agents sitting across from her like judges at a tribunal. Mrs. Whitmore, Agent Rodriguez began, placing a digital recorder on the coffee table between them. I need to advise you that this conversation is being recorded. You have the right to have an attorney present. Am I under arrest? Margaret's voice came out higher than she intended. Not at this time, but I strongly recommend you contact your attorney. Rodriguez's tone was professional, but firm. What we're discussing today could have serious legal implications. Margaret's hands trembled as she dialed Richard's office. His secretary put her through immediately. Richard must have been waiting for this call. Margaret, don't say anything until I get there. Her husband's voice was sharp with panic. Nothing. Do you understand me? Richard, I think I made a terrible mistake. I know you did. I'll be there in 20 minutes. As they waited, Agent Webb walked Margaret through the timeline of events while Rodriguez reviewed her notes. The casual questions felt like scalpel cuts, each one revealing another layer of Margaret's growing culpability. So you received Mr. Chen's explanation that the object was part of a federal investigation, Webb said, but you chose to have it removed anyway. I thought he was lying. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. He's been ... unstable. Since his demotion? I thought he was just trying to make his hobby sound important. Rodriguez looked up sharply. His hobby? His airplane obsession? Everyone knows he got transferred from his position at the airport. I assumed he was just collecting scrap metal, pretending it was something official. The look that passed between the two agents made Margaret's blood run cold. Mrs. Whitmore, Rodriguez said carefully, David Chen isn't a hobbyist. He's a senior aeronautical engineer with the FAA, currently on administrative reassignment, and the scrap metal you had removed is a critical piece of evidence from Midwest Regional Flight 447, which killed 17 people 3 weeks ago. The room seemed to spin around Margaret. She gripped the arm of her chair, fighting waves of nausea. 17 people. 17 people, Webb confirmed, including a 6-year-old girl named Emma Martinez who was flying to see her grandmother. For the first time, the cruelty of the detail wasn't accidental. Margaret could see it in Webb's eyes. He wanted her to understand the human cost of her actions. A 6-year-old girl, someone's granddaughter. Richard Whitmore arrived like a hurricane in an expensive suit, his usually perfect appearance disheveled from his panicked drive across town. At 56, Richard was a partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, accustomed to solving problems with strategic phone calls and calculated settlements. But as he took in the scene federal agents, recording equipment, his wife's ashen face, Margaret could see him calculating odds and not liking the results. Gentlemen, ma'am, he corrected himself, nodding to Rodriguez. I'm Richard Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore's attorney. I need a moment to confer with my client. Rodriguez gestured, toward the kitchen. "Take your time." The moment they were alone, Richard rounded on his wife with barely controlled fury. "Margaret, what exactly did you do?" In halting, broken sentences, Margaret explained the morning's events. With each word, she watched her husband's face grow paler. "Jesus Christ, Margaret, do you understand what obstruction of justice means? Do you understand that you've potentially destroyed evidence in a mass casualty investigation?" "I didn't know. You didn't know, because you didn't listen." Richard's voice rose to a harsh whisper. "The man told you it was part of a federal investigation, and you had it towed anyway because it offended your aesthetic sensibilities." Margaret began to cry, not the elegant tears she'd perfected for charity galas, but ugly, desperate sobs. "Richard, what's going to happen to me?" Her husband looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, disappointment, mixed with something that might have been contempt. "I don't know, but we're about to find out." Back in the living room, Rodriguez had been fielding phone calls. Her face was grim as she rejoined the group. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, we have a problem. The wing section your wife had removed has disappeared." Richard went very still. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "Apex Towing delivered it to Morrison's scrapyard at 2:47 p.m., Webb explained, consulting his notes. "By the time we got there, with a warrant at 4:15, the piece had already been processed through their metal shredder." The sound that escaped Margaret's throat was barely human. She'd destroyed evidence that could have proven 17 people died needlessly. Evidence that could have prevented future deaths. Evidence that was now confeticized pieces of metal mixed with tons of other scrap. "However," Rodriguez continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, "we did find something interesting when we interviewed the scrapyard owner." She pulled out her phone and played an audio recording. A gravelly male voice filled the room. "Yeah, some lady called about an hour before the tow truck showed up. Said she was expecting some airplane parts to come in, and she wanted to make sure they got processed immediately. Offered me an extra $500 cash to run them through the shredder as soon as they arrived. Said it was some kind of insurance thing, needed to be destroyed for legal reasons." Margaret's world tilted on its axis. "That wasn't me. I never called any scrapyard." "We know," Rodriguez said coldly. "We traced the call. It came from Meridian Aircraft Corporation's legal department, specifically from a phone registered to Senior Legal Counsel Patricia Vance." The implications hit Richard like a physical blow. They knew the aircraft manufacturer knew what that piece would prove, and they used Margaret's HOA complaint as cover to destroy it. "That's our working theory," Webb agreed. "Mrs. Whitmore, you weren't just an overzealous neighbor protecting property values. You were an unwitting accomplice in a corporate cover-up that's left 17 families without answers and potentially hundreds of passengers flying in defective aircraft." Margaret felt something break inside her chest. She'd been played, used, manipulated by people who saw her petty neighborhood tyranny as the perfect tool for corporate murder. "The question now," Rodriguez said, leaning forward, "is whether you're going to help us prove it." Richard started to object, but Margaret held up her hand. For the first time in months, her voice was steady and clear. "What do you need me to do?" Rodriguez and Webb exchanged glances. "We need you to make a phone call, Mrs. Whitmore, to Patricia Vance at Meridian Aircraft. You're going to tell her that there might be another piece of evidence from the crash site, and you want to make sure it gets properly disposed of. You want me to wear a wire." Margaret's voice was barely audible. "We want you to help us catch the people who used you to cover up mass murder," Rodriguez said bluntly. "Because make no mistake, Mrs. Whitmore, that's what this is. 17 people died because Meridian Aircraft put profits over safety, and they used your complaint about property values to destroy the evidence that would have proven it." Margaret looked at her husband, seeing her own horror reflected in his eyes. She thought about Emma Martinez, 6 years old, excited to see her grandmother. She thought about Captain Morrison, 30 years of spotless service destroyed by a lie. She thought about David Chen, trying to seek justice and being punished for his integrity. "If I do this," she said quietly, "what happens to me?" Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. "That depends on a lot of factors, Mrs. Whitmore. Your cooperation, the strength of the case we can build, the prosecutor's discretion. But I can tell you this, if you help us expose this cover-up, you'll be doing more good than you've probably done in your entire life." Margaret closed her eyes, seeing her perfect life crumbling around her. The HOA presidency, the social standing, the carefully constructed image of respectability, all of it was gone. But maybe, just maybe, she could salvage something from the wreckage. Maybe she could help 17 families get the truth they deserved. When she opened her eyes, they were clear and determined for the first time in years. "Make the call," she said. Across the street, David Chen stood at his window, watching the federal agent's car in his neighbor's driveway. He didn't know what was happening in that pristine living room, but he could see Margaret Whitmore's silhouette through the curtains, and something about her posture suggested that the woman who'd destroyed his evidence might finally be discovering what justice actually looked like. The FBI's mobile surveillance unit looked like a cable company van, complete with magnetic signs and a bored-looking technician in coveralls sitting in the driver's seat. Inside, the space was crammed with recording equipment, monitors, and agent Rodriguez, who was making final adjustments to the wire taped beneath Margaret's silk blouse. "Remember," Rodriguez said, her voice steady and professional, "we need her to admit they knew what the evidence would prove. Don't push too hard, let her talk. Corporate lawyers love to explain how clever they are." Margaret's hands shook as she smoothed down her blouse. 24 hours ago, her biggest concern had been whether the neighbor's landscaping met HOA standards. Now she was about to help the FBI bring down a billion-dollar corporation for mass murder. "What if she doesn't say anything incriminating?" Margaret asked. "Then we keep building the case other ways," Webb replied from his position. "At the monitoring station, but Margaret, these people destroyed evidence that could have saved lives. They used you to do it. Don't you want to make them pay?" Margaret thought of Emma Martinez, 6 years old, flying to see her grandmother for the first time. "Yes, I want to make them pay." The phone call to Patricia Vance had been surprisingly easy to arrange. Margaret had simply identified herself as the HOA president who'd helped resolve the debris issue the day before. Vance had agreed to meet immediately. Apparently, corporate conspirators were just as eager to cover their tracks as they were to create them in the first place. The rendezvous point was a coffee shop in downtown's financial district, neutral territory where a suburban HOA president might believably meet with a corporate attorney. Margaret sat at a corner table, nursing a latte she couldn't taste, watching the door with the focused intensity of a predator. Patricia Vance looked exactly like what Margaret expected from a corporate lawyer, 50s, expertly maintained, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting her way through a combination of money, influence, and barely legal intimidation. "Mrs. Whitmore," Vance slid into the seat across from Margaret, her smile as genuine as a campaign promise. "Thank you for reaching out. I understand you were quite efficient, in resolving our mutual problem yesterday." Margaret forced herself to smile back. "I believe in maintaining community standards, Ms. Vance, though I have to admit I was surprised to receive your call about the scrapyard arrangements. Well, we certainly appreciate proactive neighbors." Vance's laugh was carefully modulated. "It saved us considerable trouble with the investigation." In the surveillance van, Rodriguez leaned forward. This was the admission they needed: investigation. Margaret kept her voice innocently curious. "I thought it was just debris from some kind of accident." "Oh, it was much more than that, Mrs. Whitmore. That piece of wing assembly would have caused us significant legal complications if it had made its way into the wrong hands." Legal complications. Meridian Aircraft has contracts with the Defense Department worth $12 billion. We couldn't allow some disgraced FAA engineers' conspiracy theories to jeopardize our national security commitments. Margaret felt sick. Vance was talking about David Chinaman, who'd risked his career to seek justice for 17 dead people, like he was some kind of terrorist threat. So the plane crash, Margaret let the question hang. Was a tragic accident caused by pilot error, exactly as our preliminary investigation concluded. Vance's voice took on the practiced cadence of someone who'd delivered this lie many times. Captain Morrison made a critical mistake during landing approach. Unfortunately, some people prefer conspiracy theories to accepting painful truths. The bile rose in Margaret's throat. She was listening to a woman calmly defame a dead pilot to protect corporate profits. A pilot whose widow was probably still fighting for his reputation, his pension, his legacy. But what if there really was something wrong with the plane? Margaret pressed. What if that piece of metal could have proven Mrs. Whitmore? Vance's voice went ice cold. There was nothing wrong with our aircraft. Our internal testing is exhaustive. The wing assembly from Flight 447 would have shown exactly what we expected it to, show that the failure occurred due to pilot-induced stress, not manufacturing defects. In the van, Rodriguez was making frantic notes. Vance had just admitted to knowing what the evidence would prove, destroying it anyway. Then why destroy it? Margaret asked, her voice barely steady. If it would have supported your version of events. Vance was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret with the calculating gaze of a predator reassessing potential prey. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Because, Mrs. Whitmore, perception matters more than truth in our business. Even if the evidence supported our conclusions, the mere existence of physical contradictions would have given plaintiff attorneys ammunition for wrongful death lawsuits. It's cleaner this way. No evidence means no questions. No questions means no liability. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. This woman was talking about 17 human lives like they were acceptable losses in a quarterly earnings report. And what about future flights? Margaret heard herself ask. What if there really is a manufacturing problem? What if more planes crash? Vance's smile was a razor blade wrapped in silk. Mrs. Whitmore, our aircraft have an exemplary safety. Record the statistical probability of another incident involving the same theoretical defect is negligible. The risk-benefit analysis clearly supports our current course of action. Risk-benefit analysis, statistical probability. Corporate euphemisms for gambling with human lives. Besides, Vance continued, we've already implemented enhanced pilot training protocols to prevent future incidents of pilot error. Problem solved. Margaret stared at this woman, this monster in a designer suit, and realized she was looking at the face of institutional evil. Not the theatrical villainy of movies, but the banal, bureaucratic evil of people who could rationalize mass murder as long as it looked good on a spreadsheet. I see, Margaret said quietly. I'm glad you understand. Vance reached into her briefcase and pulled out an envelope. This contains compensation for your assistance yesterday, along with a standard non-disclosure agreement. Sign it, and we can all move forward with our lives. Margaret opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a legal document that would legally bind her to silence about everything she'd learned. $50,000. Margaret's voice came out in a whisper. Plus legal protection from any potential federal complications, Vance added smoothly. Our attorneys are very good at making inconvenient problems disappear. Margaret stared at the check. $50,000. Her silence about 17 deaths bought and paid for with corporate blood money. Mrs. Whitmore. Vance's voice carried a subtle note of impatience. The agreement does have a time-sensitive component. Margaret looked up, and for the first time in the conversation, her smile was genuine. Ms. Vance, I need to tell you something. Oh, I don't think I'm going to be signing your agreement. Vance's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to dawning alarm. I'm sorry. Margaret reached under her blouse and pulled out the wireless microphone, placing it carefully on the table between them. I said, I won't be signing your agreement, but I will be testifying at your trial. The color drained from Patricia Vance's face as she stared at the recording device. Around them, the coffee shop erupted into carefully orchestrated chaos as FBI agents materialized from behind newspapers and laptop screens. Patricia Vance, Agent Rodriguez announced, her badge gleaming in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. You're under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, destruction of federal evidence, and accessory to 17 counts of negligent homicide. Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with property values or social status. 6 months later, Margaret Whitmore stood in a federal courthouse, watching Patricia Vance and 3 other Meridian aircraft executives being led away in shackles. The trial had been a media sensation: corporate conspiracy, federal cover-ups, the unlikely HOA president who brought down a billion-dollar corporation. David Chen approached her in the courthouse hallway, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Whitmore, he said simply. Mr. Chen. Margaret's voice was steady. I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. You helped catch the people responsible. For 17 deaths, David replied. That matters more than anything else. Margaret nodded, then asked the question that had been haunting her for months. The wing assembly, were you right? Was it a manufacturing defect? David's smile was sad, but satisfied. The FBI found internal Meridian documents during their investigation. They'd known about potential stress fractures in that wing design. For 2 years, Captain Morrison never had a chance. And his family, they'll receive full compensation, and his record will be cleared. More importantly, all aircraft with that wing design have been grounded pending